Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Stacy, and I'm a bookseller and the events coordinator at Belmont Books. Belmont Books, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent and locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we have a number of virtual events coming up, including Kathy Sherbrooke and Alexi Pappas in conversation with Lynn Griffin tomorrow, and our monthly bedtime story time on Thursday. You can register for these and our other events on our website, belmontbooks.com, which is also where you can purchase tonight's book, Prohibition Wine, and I will send out the link to that later. If you have any questions for the authors, please type them into the Q&A section and we will get to as many questions as we can. We're very excited to welcome Marian and Pamela. I'd like to tell you a little bit about them and then I will turn the event over to them. Marian Leah Knapp is a writer and community activist. Her previously published books include Aging in Places, Reflective Preparation for the Future, A Steadfast Spirit, The Essence of Caregiving, and with Vivian Goldman, The Outermost Cape, Encountering Time. When Marian was 64 years old, she went back to school to obtain a PhD in environmental studies. Her goal was to use what she learned to benefit her community and those who were aging along with her. She passed her dissertation defense right before her 70th birthday. For more than 10 years, Marian has written a column for the Newton Tab from the perspective of an older adult who knows from personal experience the realities of that life stage. Marian, who has 2 sons, 2 daughters-in-law, and 3 grandchildren, lives in Newton. She's a strong, outspoken advocate for seniors. Professor Pamela Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University, where she directs the Jewish Studies program and received the university's highest award, Scholar and Teacher of the Year. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985. A past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and the recipient of the American Jewish Historical Society's Lee Max Friedman Award for Distinguished Service. Her consulting work for museums includes the National Museum of American Jewish History and the Library of Congress. She is a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research. Pamela's recent book, America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, won the 2019 National Jewish Book Awards Jewish Book of the Year. And without further ado, I will turn the event over to Marian and Pamela.
Thank you, Stacy. Thanks. So before we dive in, I just have to say I am in awe of Marian getting a PhD just shortly before her 70th birthday. So bravo, congratulations. And I guess I shouldn't be surprised because I was so taken with Prohibition Wine and the story that you tell us in this book. So would you start us off by telling us how you came to write this book?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And it's taken me a long time to write this book. When I was growing up, I would hear my father and my uncles and my aunt talk about their childhood. And they would talk about what it was like growing up in Wilmington, Massachusetts, poor, without a father, and how their mother sold blueberry wine during Prohibition. And my father wrote his autobiography, and my uncle wrote his autobiography, but they weren't really publishable documents. And I sort of knew in the back of my head from very early on that I would someday combine what they wrote and write a book. And then after reading and rereading their autobiographies, I decided that I really didn't want to write the book about them. I wanted to write about their mother. Because she was the one that kept them all together when they were children. And that put me on a whole journey of learning and understanding family history and immigration records. So I wrote the book really in honor of my father and my aunt and uncles, and also to this woman who I never knew.
So do you want to read for us the story of the journey of your grandmother that you wrote, or do you want to tell us?
Well, I have things written, but I find it's distracting. So what I think I'll do a little bit of both, if that's okay.
Okay.
So I'll start off. This is from the first chapter of the book, but so I'm going to begin by the time in Russia when they were living in Russia. In the winter of 1886, Simon Wernick and his teenage daughter, Rebecca, stopped at a tavern during a peddling trek around Vilna, Gubernia, which is a governmental district around Vilna, the city of Vilna. And they stopped at a tavern. And the story that I heard was they stopped at a tavern. And I always wondered, what is a man doing bringing his child, his daughter, to a tavern? And as it turns out, taverns were one of the few businesses that Jews could run in the Russian Empire. So it was a very logical place for them to stop. And these taverns served everybody. They served peasants, they served Cossacks, they served the aristocracy and Jews. So they were community places for everybody. And on the day that my great-grandfather stopped, there were several Cossacks in this tavern. And my grandmother, Rebecca, sat near the stove to warm herself because her feet were very cold. And what I heard was that she didn't have any shoes on. And what happened was a Cossack came up to her and began to aggressively touch her. And she drew back and slapped the Cossack's face, which if anyone knew anything about the Cossacks, that was not a very good thing to do, is to hit one of these Cossacks. So she ran home in the snow without her shoes. And the Cossack could have easily followed her, but he didn't. And I think it was at that point that her father realized it was time for them to leave the old country. So that was her beginning.
It's such an amazing story. First of all, it speaks to us today. When we've been dealing for the past couple of years with the Me Too movement, and I think it's so important for us to uncover these stories of sexual harassment from the past. So who knows what really happened, because it has elements almost of a fantasy. I mean, she manages to escape from the Cossacks. She doesn't have shoes, which is quite possible. I mean, very poor Jews, but so not having anything, to wrap their feet in. And then, but her father also understanding that's the moment that it was time to leave. And of course, she's one of, over 2 million East European Jews who are on the move in those years.
Right. So they had been living through anti-Semitism, and I don't even know what shtetl they lived in, but they knew that it was not safe for them. So he left and came to this country and ended up in Boston. And then he came first, and then Rebecca and her sisters came next. And then the mother with 4 younger children came to Boston. So I'm going to read something from chapter 3. So between 1890 and 1900, Rebecca and her sisters were employed making gloves at a factory on LaGrange Street in the South End. They lived in the North End. And today it feels like the North End and the South End of Boston are somewhat far apart. But in those days, she would walk from the North End across Scollay Square, which is no longer there, to Tremont Street, along the side of the Boston Common, which was there because it's the oldest public park in the country. And then she took a left on LaGrange Street and went to work at this factory on number 36. And it would have taken her less than an hour to make this walk, but there were a lot of distractions. So for example, on the streets and around, because this is sort of the heart of Boston, and the streets were a mess. There were, there was horse manure in the streets. There were carriages and people trying to move from one place to another. So the city of Boston decided to bury a railroad track under the ground. And it was the first subway in the country. And in order to get to her job, she had to walk past this construction every day, with the construction and all of the dirt and the filth on the streets in Boston. So I can picture her, I try to picture her walking the street and what it was like, and holding her dress up to make sure, try to keep her skirt clean. And she lived at home, and she waited until all her older sisters all got married before she could get married. So finally in 1900, which is about 10 years after she arrived here, they found a husband for her, and his name was Nathan Goldberg. And he was a storekeeper, and they were married on January 4th, 1900. Now, I just want to add something interesting in that his last name was originally not Goldberg. The name was Majafis or Mayufis or Mayafis, which was actually from the Hebrew Mayafit, which means how beautiful. And the Mayafit were the Mayafis were musicians, and they would be called by the aristocracy, send me my Majafis, Mayufis, and they would come and play for whoever asked them to play. So, but his name changed to Goldberg when he got here.
So I have so many questions because, first of all, I'm just so impressed with your research, and I hear your environmental studies degree, playing a role in trying to picture what it was like for your grandmother to make that trek from the north end to the south end. You said something really interesting. You said they found a husband for her. So do you think that this was essentially an arranged match, which many immigrant Jewish women were fighting against? I mean, they certainly still existed, but do you think that's what happened in your family?
I think that is what happened. But again, this was a piece that I had to fill in for myself, because she was already getting old to be married. She was 24.
How old was she?
24. And well, in those days that was, and if you became an old maid, that was really bad, to not be married. So I suspect that they had a matchmaker that found her husband, Nathan.
Yeah, so interesting. And what do you know about I'm interested in the glove factory where she worked, because we tend to know more about the New York story than we know about the Boston story for the East European Jewish immigrants. And of course, we know about the shirtwaist makers, and they made wrappers, which would have been like, house dresses, something like that. But we don't hear so much about them sewing gloves. And when I think of gloves, I would imagine a lot of them were leather in that period, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, actually, that in itself is a whole interesting story. There was a family also from Vilna, and their name was Helpern, and they were leather makers in the old country and brought that craft to this country. And my great-grandfather knew that family. And it turned out that some of those members of that family went to Gloversville, New York. And because there was a lot of leather manufacturing, right, Gloversville, New York. Because there was a lot of leather manufacturing in that area of New York State. So actually my grandmother and three of her sisters very shortly after they got to this country, they went to Gloversville and learned how to make gloves. And then, and I won't disclose this here, but there was a very tragic event that brought them back to Boston. But they still worked, but the Halpern family did have a factory on LaGrange Street in Boston. And so they ended up working there. So on all of the census records for them, it said that for all of the sisters who survived, it said occupation, glove maker.
Wow, wonderful. I hope our audience is getting a sense of what an amazing researcher you are. Before I ask you to read another passage, I do want to remind everyone that you can use the Q&A and post questions in the Q&A. Right now, I'm getting to ask all the questions, but we want to have a chance for you to ask them as well. So Marian, would you like to read us another section, please?
Okay, so this one, this is from chapters 4 and 5, and it's about their marriage. And my grandfather, who of course I never knew, but he was a man that he relished change. He had an incessant desire to keep searching for something new. This was a theme of all of his existence. He was constantly seeking a new idea, a new way to earn a living, a new place to live. He had a compelling personality. He was extremely strong physically, but he was an unsettled person. In the early years of their marriage, Rebecca gave birth to 4 children in as many years. And they were at that time living in Lowell, Massachusetts. And they kept moving from one apartment to another apartment because they could not settle down. And he was a peddler. So he would go on the road and he would sometimes take the whole family, his wife with a suckling baby, and they would go with him. And he went to Connecticut, and he went to New York State, and he went to Pennsylvania. And then, of course, he traveled locally in the Boston area, Somerville, Cambridge. And it was an extremely difficult life. They were roaming around. And then after years of hardship and impulsive roving, Nathan met a land speculator who was selling wooded lots in Wilmington, Massachusetts, which is about 15 miles north of Boston. Rebecca, with the experience of his roaming around, was very skeptical, and she gave him a very hard time that he was spending money, and how are they going to pay for this? But her protests had no effect. He had already made the deal without talking to her about it. And he spent $9 down and 50 cents a week. And they agreed on a handshake, and he bought a 2-acre piece of property on a street that was still unnamed. Within a few months, he and the older children built a dwelling of wood covered in tar paper. They set out a garden plot, peas, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and they built a 2-seat outhouse. They planted apple trees and dug a well, and then they moved in, and they made arrangements for milk and ice to be delivered. So, and in addition to that, they built a horse stable and a gigantic chicken coop that had an incubator. And when the chickens began laying eggs, Rebecca began to have a little egg route where she would put eggs in a suitcase, get on the train in Wilmington, go to Boston, and travel around friends and relatives in Boston neighborhoods, Chelsea, Dorchester, Roxbury, the North End, the West End. And he started a wholesale egg business. However, in 1918, it was actually Yom Kippur. The house, they had to build another house. It was a new house. It wasn't quite finished, and Nathan died. He was actually run over by a train. And she was left a widow with 6 children. The oldest was 16, and the youngest was 2.5. So when Nathan died, Rebecca lost most of the family income. And he died in September of 1918. And in 1919, Prohibition was passed to be enacted in January of 1920. And one of her customers in Chelsea, Mass, said to her, "Rebecca, you could make a little extra money. I'm brewing alcohol, ethanol in my downstairs in the 3-decker where I live. I'll give you some, you mix it with some stuff and you can sell it and you can make a little extra money." And she was afraid because she was an immigrant and she was a Jew, and it's not clear that she was a citizen, but she had to put food on the table. So she brought a jug of raw alcohol home, mixed it with some things, and then set the word out a little bit in Wilmington. And she got her first customer was a house painter that she knew, and he bought a bottle. And that was the beginning of her, entry into bootlegging.
Right. So interesting. First of all, before he dies, they're essentially chicken and egg farmers, right? And yeah,
yes.
And that's an aspect of that immigrant experience that most people don't know about. They don't realize that there were Jews who ended up in farming, sometimes because they deliberately, in this case, seems to be that he failed at other businesses, and so this is something that he falls back on. What I found so interesting is, how did you find the places that he was peddling and dragging the family to? How did you find that part of the story?
Some of that information came from my father's autobiography, because he remembers some of those days and being on the wagon, and the wagons, turning over, and that you'd name a place and he would say, "Oh, I was in Scranton, Pennsylvania," or "I was in, Connecticut," as a young boy, but he remembered that. So that's how I know where he traveled.
How old was your father when he was doing the traveling?
Probably maybe 6 to 8 or 10 years old, because he was 14 when his father died. So he was a young boy, but old enough to remember.
But what about school?
Well, that's an excellent question, because every place that they went, they had to change schools. So right. when he bought the house in Wilmington, that was the first time that they had a stable place to live, and that the children could go to school, and the same school every year. And that was a huge. Yeah, go ahead.
What was Wilmington like then? Were there other Jews around, or would that have mattered to them?
Well, there were not that many Jews in Wilmington. There were a few. I don't think there was a synagogue. But they had a few Jewish friends, and my grandmother would talk to people in Polish. She spoke Polish, but these were people from Poland and not Jews from Poland. Right. They were really an anomaly in the community.
Right. So really kind of striking out on their own, because it's not like they were in one of the Jewish agricultural colonies in Vineland, New Jersey, for example, or Farmingdale, New Jersey. Very interesting. So interesting. And then, of course, the change. I mean, this is what we know of the broad history is when either their husbands, women with families, with children, when either their husbands died or they deserted them, that they fall into poverty, and they need to figure out something to do to put food on the table. But so interesting when you say he got hit by a train. Did anybody in the family think that he committed suicide?
No, he did not commit suicide. He was actually on his way to work on Yom Kippur. And Wilmington, the area around Wilmington, Woburn, that area north of Boston had, first of all, a lot of tanneries, but it also had, during the First World War, had a lot of war production plants. And he had a job in one of those plants, and he was on his way to work, and he went to the train yard and was trying to, one thing I don't know is whether or not he was actually trying to getting on a train to go to work, but he stepped out between some train cars that were stationary, and there was what's called a shifter engine or switcher engine, which is one of these little engines that moves cars around a train yard. And so it was coming down the track, and he stepped into the path of the train. The shifter, the switcher, and yes, it was really awful, terrible. Yeah.
So do you want to read us another section so we can learn more about what it was like to sell Prohibition wine?
Sure. My grandmother was very cautious. Anytime anybody would come to her back door, she would say, "What do you want? Who sent you? You know, how do you know about me?" But they would come to the back door, and she would sell them pints of whatever it was that she made. And I have more information about that, for $1 or $1.25 a pint. And in those days, that was a lot of money. She knew she was breaking the law, but the whole family was very good about protecting her and protecting her business. But what happened was they had struggled so long, for so many years, for every penny in the past. Now, with her selling alcohol, the kids could go to the movies once in a while for a nickel, or they could buy new clothes instead of wearing hand-me-downs, or they could buy bread rather than having bread given to them from relatives in Boston. So although there was this surreptitious activity going on, their standard of living improved. I won't say dramatically, but certainly enough so that they could do some of these things which were seen as luxuries during that time. So what happened, and she got to be known in the community. Everybody knew Mrs. Goldberg, and her alcohol. So what happened one evening in early August of 1925, so about 5 years after she started selling, 2 hired detectives came to Rebecca's back door and attempted to buy a bottle of alcohol. She talked with them. She asked, the same questions, who sent you? And she was wary, but she wouldn't make a direct sale. So she left a half pint on the back stoop. And the next morning there was 75 cents on the stoop, and with the bottle of alcohol gone. Within a couple of days of that encounter, there was a raid on the house by the Wilmington police. So I'll talk a little bit about this. With Prohibition, when it was started, there was virtually no way to enforce the law. There was inadequate policing. And there was just no way to do it. So towns began to hire these detectives or spotters that would try to entrap people. And that's what happened. She was entrapped by these hired policemen or detectives. So they raided the house, and they found bottles of blueberry wine. That was her famous drink, was blueberry wine, some beer, but she didn't make beer, so she must have gotten that from someplace else. But they missed some bigger stashes that were hidden in the chicken coop and in the base of the dining room table. But anyway, she was summoned to court in front of a judge, and I'm going to read the example from headline, because this made headline news. It was one of the first cases that had come before a court in prohibition in this region. So in the Boston Daily Globe, August 11th, 1925, and I have the copies of the original newspaper, says judge turns down spotter evidence. Morton, who was the judge, frees Wilmington rum case defendants, saying detectives hired by selectmen lied. So the judge, dismissed her case, and there were other people that were called to court that day. And in the Wilmington police history for 1925, that was their biggest year for bringing people in for selling illegal alcohol. They don't name any names, but I know my grandmother is in that roster. I won't tell more about that, because there's stuff in the book about why one of the big reasons why he dismissed the charges, but people can read that in the book. So once that happened, her older children were some of them had already been graduated from college and were working and living at home and bringing in money to feed the family. There were still a few that still had to get through school and finish their education. And she had to decide, did she want to continue selling alcohol or not? But she actually liked it, I think, because she liked that conspiracy. She liked, talking through the back door, with these criminals, and she was a criminal. So anyway, but she decided that she didn't want to take any chances. And so she stopped selling alcohol. And she basically still ran the farm. She still raised chickens and sold eggs. And for a while she had the house that second house that they had built was a place for people to come from Boston, because there was a lake in Wilmington and people would come to the house and she would cook food for them, and they would, get out of Boston into the country. So she did that for a while. But she stopped working. Then some of the kids were still at home when she died at age 64, and she died in 1940. And I don't know what the diagnosis was of her death. I met her when I was 18 months old, but of course I don't remember. So so I was born in 1938 and she died in 1940.
Wow, such an incredible story. All the different things that she did to earn a living and to put food on the table. And then you mentioned that the children graduated college. I don't know if all of her children graduated college, but this is the American dream, right?
Well, actually, only my father graduated from college. All of her other children did graduate from high school, and that was her goal. She was absolutely determined that her children would get a high school education. And not only that they were to be the best students in the school, and they were. So they all did, they all took different paths after they graduated from high school. But there was a cousin who was actually a well-known Jewish writer and encyclopedist who lived in New York. And he helped put my father through what was then Mass Aggie, which was Massachusetts Agricultural College, which is now UMass Amherst. So my father graduated from college, which was amazing. But when Nathan died, her husband died, the town said that they would help her out financially if she would take the children out of school and make them go to work. And she said no. She said, my kids are going to graduate from high school. Yeah.
So I think it's really important for our audience to understand how unusual it was to graduate high school. That, it's not until really the 1920s that high school, that even becomes free public education in most places until 12th grade, that many people in the United States only had an education through the 8th grade. It was rare for people to go to high school. And of course, very unusual, like for your father to go on to college.
Right.
Very, very impressive. But she understood that was the path to the future.
I think so.
Not to put.
Right. And of course, I didn't know her, but I suspect that she couldn't, when she came to this country, she was too old to go to school, and she was a girl, because her younger brothers, when they got here, they went to school. And although I don't know, but just from what I've learned about her, I wonder if she was an early feminist, saying these, that doesn't, because both her sons and her daughters were graduated from high school. She didn't make that decision.
So if I did the math right, and she came in 1890, she was probably 14. So
yes.
She was too old to go to the public school. She was old enough to go out to work. And
right.
There's actually, maybe you read her, there's a wonderful memoir written by a Boston Jewish immigrant named Mary Antin called
yes.
The Promised Land. And
yes.
Mary Antin's story is that her older sister goes into the factory, but Mary's young enough that she squeezes herself into a desk meant for the kindergarten, and then vaults through once she learns English. And so much of the research shows that the immigrant Jewish women who came to America yearned to learn. They so badly wanted to learn. So I could see that she passed that on to her children.
Really, yes. Really and also, if you compare Boston to New York, for the immigrant generation, there were more opportunities in New York for immigrants and women immigrants to be able to go to school. But that wasn't true in Boston. It didn't have the resources that New York had. And also, one of the things
New York has is free college. And
yeah,
high school,
right.
Yeah.
Right. And there was a younger sister, Rebecca had a younger sister who was a very young child when she came here. But I don't know if she actually did go to high school, because on her census record that I found she was a glove maker. So she may have not gone to high school because she went out to work because she was a girl.
And because she had to. I mean, very often the pattern was that sisters would help their brothers stay in high school, go on to college. And you said already, it's a family economy. The older children are contributing to the economy, and she's doing everything she can, including being a bootlegger, to the family together. So I'm so curious. Harriet Edelberg has asked, she says your surname growing up was Gilbert.
Yes.
Why did your father change? And I'm going to add, and when?
Okay. Well, I have to tell you, Harriet Edelberg I've known since I was a baby. We've known each other all our lives. So my father's name was Goldberg. And it was during the Depression. And one of the things that happened was that he wanted to get away from the family when, having grown up in this environment, he needed to get away and try to find himself. So he went to California, and he was there and he couldn't get a job. And one of the reasons he thought he couldn't get a job because of his Jewish last name. So he changed his name to Gilbert, and I actually have the papers from California with his name change, the official documents with his name change. So I'm the only, my father was the only Gilbert in the family.
Right. Kirsten Vermaglich wrote a wonderful book called, won a major prize, called A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. And she shows exactly that happening. It's that the myth is that everybody's name got changed at Ellis Island.
Right.
That's totally ridiculous
Not true.
because
Right.
they had ship's manifests and they had the names written out in the ship's manifest. So there was
Right.
no reason to change the name. And that especially, you know, the years between World War I and World War II in the United States are the apex of anti-Semitism until maybe today. And what we know is a strategy for coping with that anti-Semitism and not being able to get a job was to change a name. So
Right.
Fermaglia studied the New York court records, but your father's story was in California, so across the country. Eileen Shavill has a really good question. Did any of your research show whether any of the children helped Rebecca make the wine, in which case she would have been making her kids criminals? I added that part.
The answer to that is yes, because she would make this blueberry wine, which she actually was making before Prohibition. And she would send the kids out into because where they lived in the country, and there were wild berry bushes, blueberry bushes all over the place. So she would send the kids out. They would bring home, you know, buckets and buckets of berries, and she would boil them up on the stove. And I heard stories about how wonderful that blueberry syrup tasted. But also my uncle Eddie, he was the youngest. He went out and would go through all the dumps and look on the side of the road to find bottles so that he could bring them home to his mother. So everybody was very happily complicit. The children were very happily involved in this production of alcoholic drinks.
Family economy, right?
Right, exactly.
Did anybody pass down the recipe?
No, I wonder about that, except one of my kids gave me a bottle of blueberry wine. But I don't know what the recipe could have been. All I know was there were blueberries and water and sugar that boiled on the stove, and she must have strained it, and basically that was the recipe. And then she added this pure alcohol. That was the wine.
Yeah, she's lucky that the guy who was providing the alcohol knew how to make ethanol as opposed to methanol, which is poisonous.
Right,
So,
right,
you know.
right.
Luann Johnson has a question. Did you come across any surprises in your research on your grandmother's life?
Well, there were a lot of surprises. One, first of all, it was doing the research where I had the surprises, because I didn't really know and understand how alcohol was made. I thought that maybe she had because the stories that came down, I thought maybe she had a still. And so what I learned was that she didn't have a still. And that's what everybody thinks of when they think about Prohibition, that all of these backwoods stills, but she didn't do that. She just made the liquid of some sort, and she just added the alcohol to it. So that I learned that. So that was a surprise. One of the things I've recently learned is that I didn't think she was a citizen, but I believe that if a man became a citizen, then his wife automatically became a citizen. And that was a surprise to me. I didn't know that. The assumptions, I won't say assumptions, but I learned things about her. One of the things that my aunt told me that her sons didn't know was that my grandmother gave herself at least one abortion with a hat pin because she couldn't take care of these children. Now, I don't know whether or not that was before or after, her husband died, because she still could have been pregnant. She was like 42 or something like that. So there weren't really surprises. There were more sort of affirmations and I guess a true understanding of what she really went through. Actually, now that's a great question, because the thing that when I was a kid, my father didn't like chicken. And I thought, how can somebody not like chicken? It was because that's all they had to eat. And I really only understood that after I had done all of the research and thought about what their daily life was like. Was they ate chicken and whatever they could grow. That was, and so there were surprises. It was, I guess the big surprise for me was the respect that I gained for her and through this research, that this idea of how did this woman manage and do it. So I guess that way, I won't say it was a surprise, but it was this recognition that I really didn't have before.
I'm so glad you mentioned about the abortion, because people don't really understand that especially for immigrant women, poor immigrant women, abortion was the most effective method of birth control that they had. The great writer Kate Simon, in A Bronx Primitive, which is her memoir of growing up in the Bronx in the 1920s, says that her mother had something like 14 abortions, and that wasn't the neighborhood record. And that her baby sister was only born because the doctor who did them in the neighborhood wouldn't give her another abortion. So how did you find out that she had one abortion?
I had interviewed my aunt Lena, and that was something that she mentioned. But also it makes sense because I looked at the years between the various babies. So I mentioned in the beginning that she had 4 babies in 4 years. And then it was 3 years till the next one. And then it was another 3 years. And then it was 4 years between babies. So she either figured out how to control her, or know her ovulation cycle, or she gave herself abortions, because that was really, as you said, that was the only choice.
Or
And
or there was an abortionist. I mean, that.
Yeah, right, but yeah, it may be, but she might not have had the money to do that.
Right. It depends, could have been neighbors, women.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. No, it's definitely. So Les Weinstein has a question for us. When Prohibition ended, did your grandmother consider going back into the business legally?
I don't think so, because now her children were working. And so they were there to bring money home and basically make sure that the house was kept up and that she was okay. And she died at age 64. And she still had many more years to live, but I don't think she did that. I think she just kept herself busy with the growing the eggs and making the deliveries into Boston and connecting with her family and friends. And I think it was, by that time it was she was probably too old and too tired to do that. And she didn't need the money.
Right. And she didn't need the money, so she didn't need to do it any longer.
Right.
I like that comment about being tired. By the way, there have been a number of really lovely comments in the chat about, what a powerful story this is. So Ellen Finkelstein asks, what do you think your grandmother would say about your lovely tribute to her through this book? And I would add, what do you think she would say about you telling everybody that she was a bootlegger?
Okay, well, that's 2 great questions. The question about what she would say about my writing this book, I think she would be very angry at me. And in fact, somebody asked me that question, and I wrote something, an interview that I was interviewing her. And in the interview, I made it clear that she just didn't want to talk about it. She just didn't want to, tell me about her story. I think probably because it was just what she had to do. I mean, it wasn't anything, and to bring attention to herself, although I think in her own way, she brought a lot of attention to herself. because she had big command over her children, and she made the, headline news in the local newspaper. So I think that she would not be happy that I was telling this story. And so what was the second part of that question?
So what do you think that she would have said about you telling everybody that she was a bootlegger?
Well, everybody knew she was a bootlegger. So, I mean, the town knew and it was, I don't know what she would think. But my father wrote about it. My uncle wrote about it. My aunt talked about it. So it was family lore. Everybody in the family knew about it. And they're all gone. I mean, I have siblings, but everybody else is gone. And I actually thought about this as I was writing this. It's like, I don't think I'm doing her a disservice. I don't think she's watching from above. But I am sensitive to the fact that this was really just struggle to survive. And her story is worth telling.
I agree. It's such a powerful story. And also, we know so much about the history of men, and we've had fewer stories about women. And so this adds tremendously to our knowledge. I don't see any more questions. Would you like to read us a closing section or make some closing remarks for us?
Sure. Actually, I had something I was going to read in the beginning, but I didn't, so I'm going to read it now. Excuse me, I'm getting organized here. This issue has been on my mind for a long time. So every once in a while, I'll go to a flea market or a yard sale, and I'll see there'll be people selling old photographs. And they're in, bins, they're in shoe boxes, they're in baskets. And I wonder who these people are and how did they end up in those boxes? Who are these people? And what are their stories? And to me, these photographs represent lost memories. These people had a life, but we don't know who they are. We only have their images. And I always wish that I would know who these people are and be able to tell their stories. So this idea has been a kind of a platform for me to here's an ordinary woman who I can tell her story. And her picture is not in a flea market shoebox.
So a couple more questions have come in. Vicki Jackson asks, what was most inspirational to you about Rebecca?
I guess her perseverance, and the fact that she just wouldn't give up, that she just kept going. And there were times that from my father's autobiography that that he said that she wanted to kill herself and she wanted to drown all her children because she just couldn't manage, but she didn't. She just kept going and organized the children around her to do what she told them to do. And they did it. So I guess that's that she could have given up. She could have sent the kids out to work, but she had a goal. I guess that's it. She had a goal to make certain that her kids, the family would stay together, that they would not be separated, and that her children would get at least a high school education. That was it. Everything else that she did went towards those goals. And I think I find that really quite astonishing. And inspiration, I won't say inspirational, but quite astonishing, excuse me, that she had that steady goal throughout her whole life. And in a way that goes back a bit to her strength when she slapped the Cossack in Russia, that she had that power and that strength to know that this person was not going to harm her and she was going to take control of that situation, which she did. And that's what she did for the rest of her life.
I think it's important to remind everyone that the Jewish orphanages that existed in this period, in the immigrant period, most of the children in those orphanages were half orphans.
Right.
Mostly their fathers had died or their mothers had died, but mostly their fathers, and their mothers couldn't keep the family together. And that's what you said. She kept the family together. And that I find very inspiring.
Right. Well, I think one reason she was able to do that is because she actually owned property. Because so many immigrants lived in rental places, did not own houses. But in spite of Nathan's roaming and unsettled behavior, he bought a piece of land. And as long as that piece of land, there was a mortgage, as long as that 50 cents a month or whatever it was got paid, she didn't have to go, she did not have to move. And that to me is actually a very, reflects on what happens with immigrants forever, is that they can't get that kind of stability. But I think if she didn't have that, I don't know whether or not she could have kept them together.
Such a good point. This has been such a fascinating conversation. So I thank you so much for inviting me to be in conversation with you. Stacy, I don't know if you want to come back on.
Hi. That was a great conversation, and I really want to thank both of you for participating in it. And Marian, it's just such a fascinating story, really. I also want to say to everybody else, thank you so much for coming, and thank you for asking such great questions. And it was really, really nice event. I hope you all have a great night. Please look for our other events on our website, on our event calendar, and we hope to see you at those as well. Thanks again, everyone, so much. Have a great night.
Thank you all. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Pam, thank you. Belmont Books, thanks for my publisher and publicist. Thank you all.